everyone, and welcome back. I am so very excited to get to share this week's video with you. I am returning back to my roots. If you don't know, I started my journey into historical shoemaking with 18th century women's shoes. And in reality, that was mostly what I did for quite a few years. It's really only been in the last about 5 years that I've started venturing outside of that century and outside of that particular style and technique into so many other different eras. That's because prior to that, I actually lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, and worked at Colonial Williamsburg, which, if you don't know, is a living history museum. It's a place where the trades from the 18th century are still being practiced. There's a lot more going on there in terms of history than that, but that is where I first learned. And that is where I worked for about 8 years. And I did a lot of my work in full costume, full 18th century clothing every single day. And part of that was making and wearing my own shoes. Now, that is not normal for everyone. That is very, very not normal. Most people wear reproduction shoes or other things that they need for comfort. But part of my experience was learning how to make those and experiencing the process of wearing them and, frankly, wearing them out a lot. Because I did a lot of walking, I killed a lot of shoes. And while I made many pairs of shoes for myself and for friends while I was there, I haven't really had a reason to for the last 5 years. I haven't done much in 18th century clothing. I still have a couple pairs of shoes that are in good enough condition to wear, so if I do, I just throw those on. And I do get a lot of requests to do a video on making 18th century women's shoes because obviously that's where I started. I have lots of examples of them, just haven't really had a reason to do it until now. A few months back, Safiya Nygaard, who is an amazing YouTuber who does all sorts of different videos on trying different things, experiencing different things, and quite a few on fashion history as well, getting to actually experience different eras of fashion and see what they feel like to actually wear for a day, reached out to Abby because both Abby and I actually worked at Colonial Williamsburg previously. That's how we met and how we became friends and know each other. And Abby has done quite a few videos talking about her experience working there, wearing that clothing, and obviously knows a lot about fashion history of that era. So it ended up being a pretty perfect circumstance of being able to talk about not only the fashion history and the experience of wearing 18th century clothing, but also working at Colonial Williamsburg and what that was like behind the scenes. The trip itself was organized with Colonial Williamsburg, so Safiya was able to actually go and spend a few days talking to the different tradespeople, talking to the character interpreters, to the historians and researchers that work there, and getting a much bigger picture than just the guest experience. And it culminated, of course, in actually getting to try on the historical clothing, see what it feels like, how it moves, and I figured shoes should be a pretty big part of that because modern shoes are made in a dramatically different way than 18th century women's shoes were, and they feel pretty different. And if she's going to have the opportunity to put on a pair of hand-stitched stays and a hand-sewn gown and all of these different parts and pieces to really understand what it feels like, we should probably have the correct style of shoes as well. And, well, I'm here, I'm available. It just timing-wise worked out perfectly. Managed to squeeze in making this pair of shoes right between a large trip to New York and heading out to Williamsburg back in October. So I have been holding on to this footage since then, and I figured it'd be the perfect opportunity to talk about 18th century women's shoes in colonial America because they are so dramatically different than our modern shoes. They look pretty different, they feel very different, they are constructed very differently. And this was a great opportunity to not only get to make that and share it with you, but also get to share it physically with someone who had never experienced it, actually gets to try it for the first time, which I always find incredibly exciting. So we started off by looking at the styles of the 18th century. It's the easiest place to begin. Styles of shoes change constantly throughout the century, and we were narrowing in on doing 1770s since that seemed to be what the rest of the outfit would be as well. Though the general look of a women's 18th century shoe is somewhat consistent. There are definitely some details that change. Early on in the century, we see more upturned pointed toes, very tiny buckles that fasten way up on top of the foot, really large, heavy, pretty chunky heels. And as the century progresses, the heels get narrower and shorter, the buckle actually gets larger and goes further down the foot, the toe goes from being a point to being round to being an almond toe by the 1770s, and all of these things will continue to progress as the century does. So style constantly is changing for these shoes, even though there is one most common style that is being worn in the colonies in that era. This is the same style that's being worn over in England and the same style in France. It's not terribly different across Europe. There are definitely some minor regional differences, but this is a pretty universal style for a lot of areas in this time. The nice thing about the buckle is that makes the shoe just a little bit adjustable, makes it a little bit more comfortable on the foot. You can tighten it up just a little bit. And this is really useful in an era where they actually are mass producing shoes in sizes. They have size ranges just like we do today, though they tend to have more variety. They have multiple widths, for example, and you can still get your shoes custom made. So you're going to be able to find a good pair of shoes no matter what. They aren't incredibly expensive, they're fairly affordable. And there are definitely lots of different styles out there, but for the most part, that simple buckle style was the most universal of that era. Now, there were tons of different options for what you made it out of in terms of the uppers and the heel cover. So you could have a whole different variety of fabric options, leather options, lots of different color choices and color combination choices. Some of them get to be pretty bright and gaudy. The most common, however, because we were going with the more common options here, we didn't want to go with the most expensive, crazy, really high-class shoe. That's not practical. That's not what most people were wearing. And it's not really necessarily the most practical experience. Instead, we went with the most common, which in that era, for that region, tended to be black calamanco. Calamanco is a specific weave and finish of wool. Wool can come in lots of different styles, but calamanco specifically has a sort of pressing and glazing process that puts a shiny finish onto the wool. Now, it is not something that is produced anymore because the type of sheep that you need to produce it aren't very common. It's not something that's in high demand. The closest thing that I personally have in my stock is wool satin, which I do happen to have in black, which, like I said, is the most common color. They certainly had other colors. It was rather fortunate in the fact that Safiya's favorite color is black. That is definitely by far the most common color that she wears, and so it seemed pretty practical to go with for lots of reasons. But we didn't want it to be too plain, so we added a little bit of interest by going with a brightly colored heel and silk binding. Again, this is really common to do, lots of different colors options for that. We went with this really fun poppy light aqua sort of mint green tone that I happen to have some leather in my collection already. So with all of the basic designs in mind, it was off to figure out the last and the heel. Now, shoes of this era, just like modern shoes today, are actually made on a last. They are not made by cutting a pattern and stitching it all together free. You actually form it and shape it over, in this era, a wooden shape. And that's what you make sure is the right proportions to fit the person. So you'll get measurements off of the foot and build up or shave down the last to match the foot and to match the style. Now, you'll notice through this entire process that it is entirely hand done. It's all hand sewing, it's all hand working with hand tools. There is no machinery involved. The only electricity I have the entire way through this is my camera and some lights. Everything else is completely done by hand. Most of my tools are actually 18th century reproduction tools. Some of them are actually even original to the 18th century. So this is really as close as I can get to the original process of how shoes would have actually been made in the 1770s. Once the last is fitted up to shape, I need to get working on designing and cutting and carving the heel. Now, this can be lots of different shapes and styles depending on the era. This particular era is pretty subtle in its shapes. I know that it needs to curve well with the last. I know that the height shouldn't be too terribly high considering the time period and the style that we're going for, but we also don't want something really clunky or awkward under the foot. It needs to balance correctly. If the heel is not placed well under the foot, then it's going to be really uncomfortable to walk in. For the heels, I usually make them out of birch wood, And the process of working them down is a bit of a slow one, sawing off different sections, sanding down curves, and gradually working my way into the correct shape. Because I need two of them that are symmetrical, and it's easier for me to take that process step by step, make sure that they match up the entire way before working them down into a soft curve that will match nicely with the shoe. I'm then also able to take a tracing off of the last to come up with a shape for the uppers. This pattern will consist of the vamp over the toe and the quarters, which are the two pieces that are the back sections. These contain the straps, so I have to make sure to draw those in as well. Once I have the pattern made up, it's time to start cutting. For the lining for this particular pair of shoes, I'm using a Wittau leather. It means that it's tawed instead of tanned, so it has a white hue to it. This I chose over a beetle linen or other lightweight linen lining because I wanted these shoes to have a little bit more structure. 18th century shoes can be rather jarring in the way that they feel on the feet, and so giving a little bit more substance can be more familiar. I'm able then to cut out the external part of the uppers out of the black wool satin, and I had to dye up the ribbon to bind the edges. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to be doing the heel covers in leather or if I might be doing some accents in silk satin as well, so I also dyed up some silk satin just in case. But here you can see matching the silk grosgrain ribbon that will bind the edges to the leather that will cover the heel. The stitching of the uppers is all done by hand. The strongest way to do the seams is a method called butting and whipping, and this is done by holding the two pieces edge to edge, whipping over them, and then pulling them back out flat. This is done not only for leather, where you don't have to worry about fraying edges, but it can also be done for the fabric as well, where you can fold over the seam allowance and whip over that edge. It's a much stronger stitch than their sort of seam where you stitch them and then open up the seam. The back also gets a little bit of reinforcement from that ribbon binding. This is a good way to add strength and keep it from separating, but it's also a really nice decorative touch. Then I'm able to start connecting the outer fabric to the leather lining. The first step is to whip over all of those edges, make sure they're not going to lose any of the fabric to fraying. I can then start backstitching on that ribbon binding. This is folded over the edge, and one single stitch goes through all of the layers at the same time in order to attach it all. This can be done in a backstitch or a spaced backstitch, and that changes depending on the style or the era. The most important place, though, for stitching is that side seam. This has to be done in a very sturdy stitch, multiple lines of stitching, to make sure that it's not going to pull and split as the shoes are worn and the uppers go through a lot of stress. This is one of the areas that I've definitely learned the most in examples that I've made over the years. From there, it's on to preparing all of the other leather bits. First up is the insole. Though it's not going to be attached to anything in the front section of the shoe, will actually be the thing that holds the heel in place. So the exact distance of the heel and the heel cover needs to be noted. The front section, however, just needs to be thinned out. I want to make sure that there's not a really heavy edge that was going to show through the fabric on the outside. Then I can move to the back where I'm tapering those edges down. I start by cutting that edge down, and then I'm able to put in the channel. This is where I'm going to start my stitches. So that way I'm already starting partway into the thickness of the leather, because these stitches are going to sit middle of the leather thickness. They're pretty much invisible from the inside of the shoe. I find it easy to mark every single one of my stitches before I go in with the awl, just to make sure that they are evenly spaced, especially around those curves. And along with an awl and some tallow to help make the process easier, I'm going through and putting in a sort of pre-drilled hole for each one of these stitches that I will do later. The sole gets done in a very similar way, but pretty much the opposite. The front portion of the sole is where the stitching will be, and the back portion will end up curving around the heel, so that's going to need to be thinned down. It doesn't need to be perfect and back just yet because I don't have the exact shape of the heel, but it's easier to start thinning it out now before it's attached to the entire shoe. Back to the front section, I'm cutting in that channel again. The same exact process is used for the outsole as the insole to make sure that everything is seated correctly. I'm midway into that leather. If I am too shallow, I risk ripping the leather and popping the stitches out as I tighten down. And if I am too deep and close to the grain side or the exterior of the leather, then I'm going to walk through that really fast and eventually walk through the threads. So you need to find a middle ground for this, something quite literally in the middle of the sole. I'm placing my stitches pretty close together because of the type of fabric that I'm using. They're not always this close. Sometimes they are much closer and much finer as well. So that varies depending on the shoe style and the amount of effort you want to put in. Once the outsole is prepared and everything is ready to go, it's time to start actually lasting the shoe. I add in what is called an instep leather, and this allows me to get the right size for the shoe itself. So that way it would fit the foot appropriately. The outsole is attached and the upper is placed on the last inside out. This is why this is called a turn shoe construction, because we are literally going to make the shoe inside out and turn it right side out. I am using particularly tiny tacks for this process because I don't want them to go all the way through the outsole, but sturdy enough that they're actually going to hold the stretching and pulling that I'm going to do in order to get the upper appropriately sized. I used to use much larger tacks, but I realized they left holes in the exterior, and you almost never see that on originals. The very large tacks that go through the sole and hold it to the last, however, those are usually visible in the exterior, and we'll deal with that at the end. Stitching the shoe together, I'm using a very heavy waxed thread. Despite this, there is still some risk of pulling those stitches out from the leather or breaking the threads, so you still have to be pretty careful. When you're going around toes and the curve that is there, you have a much tighter space, so there's actually an extra piece of scrap thread that is wrapped around as I stitch each one of these closed. It helps to reinforce that curve or point, whatever the toe shape is. And then each stitch can be pulled down really tight. I utilize the awl in my right hand to wrap the thread around and pull snugly. On my left hand, I should have a hand leather to prevent me from gradually causing a lot of damage to my hands, but mine apparently doesn't fit anymore, so I really need to make a new one. But despite that, I'm still able to get a really tight, strong stitch with each one of these. Inside each of those holes, there is a tiny knot between the two threads, and this really pulls down and holds each into place. So that way, even if the sole is worn away and we start to walk through the threads, they will hold themselves together, knot by knot, stitch by stitch. That's one of the reasons why the dark wax is there. It's very sticky. It's made out of resin and tar and beeswax. So this is a thread, a wax, a stitching pattern chosen to make sure that this shoe can hold together for as long as possible. Once the stitching is in place, then I can start to trim down that extra seam allowance around the front. One of my favorite tricks is that beeswax actually does a great job working as sort of a glue. So once I rub the beeswax on, it's still warm and sticky, so I'm able to hammer down the fabric and leather seam allowances to keep them in place, which is really important when I go to do the turning and reinsert the insole, that these aren't sticking up and getting in the way. This is a trick that we know was done in the period, and I've seen plenty of examples of it in both 18th and 19th century books, and I just love this part of the process. Another important step here is to put an inlay of wool broadcloth between the two layers. This will not only provide warmth and some water resistance, but will actually keep the two layers of leather from squeaking. If you've ever had a pair of shoes that squeaks, especially after it got wet, well, that's why. It's two layers of leather rubbing against each other, so this will prevent that. I am then ready to unlast the shoe and flip it right side out. Once you remove the instep leather, it's pretty easy to pop the last out. That's one of the reasons for that to be a separated piece. And the actual process of flipping the shoe, it can be pretty easy depending on the shoe and depending on the sole leather. This is one of the reasons why turn shoes have to be fairly lightweight with their sole leather, because you need to be able to fold it in half. And really heavy leather is not going to do that easily. But I've done this plenty of times with this style of shoe, so I don't have too much of a problem managing. And once you get down to the toe, the whole thing just pops right out, and you end up with what starts to actually properly resemble your shoe. The hard part here, though, is that we have to get the insole and the last back in. You can't obviously tack the insole down in the front since you're going to be putting it inside of the entire shoe. So there's this little trick of cutting a slit, putting in a wooden peg, and it will actually be able to be removed with the peg still in it. We then need to add in our paste. We're not using glues or cements in this era. It is a water-soluble paste, basically flour and water. And then the entire last can be reseated. This is the hard part of the process, and they actually had special tools to help with this. At some point, I hope to get one of those reproduced. It helps pull up the back section after the front part is relasted. Currently, I'm just sort of prying it up there using a bone folder, so that way I have a little bit of help getting it over the initial edge of the heel, and then it's just sort of gradually working it up and over. This is a really tight fit because we've relasted it with extra bulk inside. It's one of the reasons I've learned over the years to not pull too tight when I am lasting the shoe wrong side out the first time. Otherwise, the thing's not going back in there. From there, I'm able to start working on the heel cover, which is the hardest part of the entire process. And this is the thing that was really only done in the 17th and 18th centuries. When heels come back in the 19th century, they don't use this method very often. It is not easy, and it's rather headache-inducing. It starts off with this heel cover being stitched on, just like I was doing at the front portion. Really simple. But as I start working my way around that curve, it kind of folds back over on itself and becomes a problem. So I can't put all through completely in one stitch through the insole, the upper, and the heel cover. I have to go through the insole, the upper, mark the heel cover, and put a hole in it separately. And the same thing has to happen with the stitches. This particular stitch requires me to do it in multiple parts. I can't pull the whole thing together and get the stitches through. This is not only a little bit tedious to do, but it's really easy to end up with lumps and bumps on the outside of your heel cover. I did have a bit of a breakthrough this time through. I've done dozens of these types of shoes, and I actually had an epiphany of what part of the thread I needed to pull before what other part, and I ended up halfway through coming up with a much cleaner and better system for it, which was so exciting. You still learn new things even after years of doing this. Then it is on to fitting the heel into the heel cover. I usually start by wetting down the heel cover and preemptively shaping it to the heel. I have not put any paste inside. They're not attached to each other in any way, but it allows me to start shaping, pulling, and stretching. And this is where you find out if the heel cover pattern that you came up with is going to work or not, because, well, if you've made it too tight of a curve, you can't fit your heel in. And if you've made it too wide of a curve, then you're going to end up with a whole bunch of wrinkles at the narrowest point of your heel. So it is a very risky game. Once I'm sure it fits though, I can add paste to the interior of the heel cover and seat the heel in for the final time, working those wrinkles out, tacking it into place, and making sure that it is as smooth as possible while the paste dries. Once the heel is properly in place, it's time to get started on shaping out that last little bit of the sole. I have to cut it down to be the correct shape to match up with what is called the heel breast. And I also need to trim it down so that way the edges are as thin as possible. I can't thin out the entire thing because I have to put some stitches through it. So I want a little bit of substance to it, about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch in, but that very edge needs to be paper thin. It too can then be pasted into place, and once that's folded into place, I can figure out the heel cap. Heel cap is that last little bit of leather that sits on the bottom of the heel. I tack it down in 3 places to make sure that it's not going to twist on me before I insert wooden pegs into each one of those spots, so that way it's really well affixed. This particular heel cap ideally is permanently attached because we're going to stitch it down. If the shoe is going to see a lot of wear and tear, I will very often preemptively add a second heel cap on top of this once it's done, just to make sure that I'm not wearing into the one with the stitching. But these wooden pegs will expand to fit the space and hold everything in place really well. In fact, the process of using wooden pegs is so effective that for a while in the early 19th century, some shoes were assembled not by stitching them together, but by using a machine that just inserted dozens and dozens of wooden pegs the whole way around the sole and heel. But we're still in the era of hand stitching, so I've got to create a channel for the stitches to fit down into in the sole and heel cap, so that way they're not sitting proud, as we call it, and sticking out where they can get worn down. I'm then able to take my very, very tiny awl blade. This one always stresses me out because it's pretty easy to snap these, and I've had them specially made, so I only have a limited quantity at this point. They're not produced anymore, but this is what gets me the really tiny stitches that you normally see that connect the heel cover and the sole together. I am not doing this nearly as tiny as was very common in the 18th century. I am still working my way down to smaller and smaller stitches as I learn and get more skilled with my tools, but this is the tiniest I've ever gone, so I'm pretty proud of myself on this one. And it's just dozens of these tiny little stitches the whole way around that clamps everything down into place. There are other methods for attaching the heel cover where the stitches are actually invisible, and it's a much faster process, but I really want to challenge myself with this. After the heel cover and everything is stitched into place, I'm then able to start working on finishing off the sole. There are lots of different ways to do this. You can burnish it down, use a little bit of gum tragacanth to shine it up, darken it, create patterns on the bottom, which is something that is not as common in all eras, but is somewhat popular, particularly in the late 1770s and 1780s. I'm choosing to use a combination of glassing and sanding the front portion of the sole where the wear will actually occur, and then burnishing up the back portion. The last step before I unlast is to close up those tack holes. This usually includes a little stamp, which sometimes is unique to the shoemaker. To stamp those holes closed, then I'm able to pop out the last, which as you can see comes right out. Even though we added that peg earlier, it pops out with the last, so that way you don't have to leave it in the shoe. And we have our final finished version.